who were going to be DNA tested, who were quite worried about the situation because they thought to themselves, well, what if they get it wrong?
But the DNA tests proved negative. They had failed to identify a suspect. John Dickinson maintained he was totally convinced the killer was a local man. But it seemed he was wrong. But if the killer was not a local man, then who was he? And it was then that Judge Roenbeck made a discovery that would change the whole focus of the investigation. He made a startling connection with an incident in the nearby town of Saint-Lunaire.
In Saint-Lunaire, that was the key for me, the case, it was Saint-Lunaire.
In identical circumstances, on the same night that Caroline Dickinson was murdered, a man had walked into a youth hostel in Saint-Lunaire and entered the room of 4 sleeping students. But here, the outcome was very different.
He had problems because the teenagers in the room, in the bedroom in Saint-Lunaire, switch on the light and ask him, "What do you do here?"
Having failed in his first attempt in Saint-Lunaire, it seemed the attacker had then driven the 25 kilometers to Plainfougère, where he murdered Caroline Dickinson.
So my first job was to get the second file, because the 2 files were not linked until that. So I wanted to read this file in order to know if it was a man who was involved in 2 facts or only 1 fact.
The link between the 2 attacks had been completely ignored by the original investigation. But Judge Roenbeck's discovery had thrown the case wide open.
It was very different, because if he was only linked in Plainfougère, it could be a man from Plainfougère. But if we had 2 facts, it could be a man from outside, not from Plainfougère, but perhaps from Saint-Lunaire, or from Brittany, or perhaps from far. And that was the worst hypothesis for me.
The second attack in Saint-Lunaire was so similar to the one that killed Caroline Dickinson that Judge Roenbeck believed a profile was emerging of a sexual predator with links to youth hostels.
I had 4 criteria. A man who was a rapist, a man who attended youth hotels, a man who was in Plainfougère. The 4th was the man who looked like the photo fit. I thought that if I had the 4 criteria on the same man, it was a good man. But we never had that.
The search then widened further to include the whole of France.
He sent messages out to all the youth hostels in France, to all the gendarmeries in France. He asked them to relate details of any sexual crimes, any crimes which had been committed against young girls, young people, young persons in youth hostels all over France.
That was a lot of people. I got a very big file from that.
The aim was to generate a list of suspects whose DNA could be tested against the sample found at the original murder.
In Plainfougère, we tested 400 people, but the global amount of the people tested in that case, more than 3,000. I was afraid from the beginning it could be a man who looked like the photo fit, who was staying just near the youth hotel, was known as a rapist, and we didn't see him. That was my fear, my fear.
The DNA testing of the 3,000 men was a very slow process. It took more than 2 years. But gradually, one name kept coming up in their inquiries: Francisco Arce Montes, a 47-year-old Spanish national who'd been arrested in France in 1994 for attempting to attack a girl in a youth hostel. His description also matched the photo fit. And despite appearing to have no connection to Plainfougère, he became the investigators' prime suspect.
Van Roenbeck had a record of this man having been arrested in La Croix de Touraine. One of the aspects which fascinated him was the fact that the person in question, Francisco Arce Montes, had something like between 10 and 12 youth hostel cards. This was a man who travelled around youth hostels for years, who was an habitué of youth hostels.
It was the last man Of course, at that time, he became very suspect because it was among the last people who have not been tested, and I think at that time it was the more interested.
The only problem was that it was impossible to trace Francisco Arce Montes.
It was the worst of the hypothesis of the beginning. It was an international migrant. He went in many countries. Very difficult, this type of people to identify, to find.
The name Francisco Arce Montes was circulated to all the police forces of Europe, but there was no trace of him.
It must be said that in 1999, 2000, things were looking pretty glum. There was a list of suspects. They'd whittled down the list of suspects. They had the name Francisco Arce Montes. He was perhaps the prime suspect. Perhaps he was the only man they had failed to trace, but nobody could find him.
To many working on the case, it appeared the trail had gone cold.
A lot of people had lost hope. Certainly I was guilty insofar as I perhaps had thought to myself, well, I don't think they're ever going to catch this guy, really. I think perhaps it might even have crossed John Dickinson's mind. Perhaps he thought, well, will they ever catch Caroline Dickinson's killer?
But then, on the 1st of April 2001, nearly 5 years after the murder, an article appeared in the Sunday Times. In this article, the name Francisco Arce Montes was made public for the first time. This was to prove a vital turning point in the investigation.
I was working with the Canadian police in a job that took me to another terminal, trying to track an individual off of a flight. Having finished that, I came back to the terminal where I worked, stopped by and picked up a newspaper at the British Air counter. Was taking the newspaper upstairs since it was almost noon. I says, well, I'll get a coffee and a donut, and that'll be my lunch, and I'll read the paper and have at it. Thumbed through it, and I saw the story about Caroline Dickinson, the 5-year anniversary edition of her murder over in France. And I remember having read about that in the past, and I was very much surprised that they hadn't tracked down the killer yet. I thought they would have had him a long time ago, and as it was, they didn't. But this time in the newspaper, they gave a name, Francisco Arce Montes. And I said, well, let's just run this guy and see if maybe by chance he's ever been to the United States.
Caroline Dickinson was raped and murdered while on a school trip to Brittany in 1996. Her father, John Dickinson, had led a tireless campaign for justice. However, in 2001, her killer was still at large. On the other side of the Atlantic, US Customs Officer Tommy Ontko had read an article in the Sunday Times in which a suspect's name had been mentioned, Francisco Arce Montes. On a hunch, Tommy decided to run this name in his computer. Much to his surprise, he got a very close match to the name.
But when it came up on our system, initially, it wasn't quite as the London Times was. It was Arce Montes as the surname and Francisco as the first name. And within just a very few minutes of running those checks, we determined that somebody with that name and a date of birth that would be consistent with the news article, published date of birth or year of his age, had actually made an entry to the United States. Some more computer checks started coming back, and it indicated that a person with the name and date of birth, who I originally ran a very close date of birth, just flipped date of birth, had been arrested down in Florida.
Just 2 weeks before Tommy's discovery, it was a sunny March afternoon on Miami Beach. 2 young backpackers on holiday from Chile were enjoying the last rays of the Florida sun. Around 6 o'clock, one of the girls stayed on the beach while her friend returned to their room at the youth hostel, the Banana Bungalow.
The Banana Bungalow is a youth hostel. It's got about 100 rooms. It's got 4 beds to a room, community restroom. It's basically for students, young people, backpackers that are traveling through, very inexpensive. You have to bring your own sheets, that sort of thing. And, you know, it's exchange students, basically.
Later that evening, the other girl also returned to their room.
¿Quién es usted, señor? ¿Qué hace aquí?
Nada.
¿Qué demonios eres tú?
Nada.
¿Qué haces aquí?
Nada.
¿Qué demonios
Nada,
haces aquí?
nada,
¿Quién es
nada,
usted?
nada, nada.
Dígame. No sé, ¿no lo viste, Marta?
The man was challenged and claimed to have mistakenly entered the wrong room and quickly disappeared. Although scared, the girls did not report the incident. Also on holiday in Miami, and staying at the Banana Bungalow, were 4 Irish students. After a day on the beach, the group had returned to their room where they were getting ready for a night out.
Guys, you see my purse in there?
During the evening, a man was seen acting suspiciously in and around the hostel. After enjoying the Miami nightlife, the girls returned to the hostel around 2 a.m. and went to bed.
The very first call was the Irish girls calling 911, wanting to report a burglary and a sexual assault. I was notified by our communications section to go to the Banana Bungalow. I spoke to all the Irish students, and they seemed extremely credible and legitimately concerned that something had occurred to them, and there was physical evidence as to the fact.
Because we called this morning because there was some man in our room.
They had gone to bed fairly late, and one of the victims, one of the girls, woke up and found a towel placed over her pelvic region. She did not go to bed with a towel over her. She went to bed in just wearing panties and a t-shirt. She also noticed that her panties had been moved, and what she told me, she felt uncomfortable in her private area. She confirmed that something had been touched. She also felt that she had been penetrated sexually somehow. We conducted an investigation in which we took some of her clothing as well as the bed sheets. We noticed immediately that on the bed sheets were what we believed to be semen. We sent it to the lab and had it analyzed, and it came back positive as semen.
Captain Vasquez spoke with the 2 Chilean backpackers, who informed him that an intruder had also entered their room the night before. The next day, an incredible coincidence. The 2 Chilean girls were shocked to see the man who had entered their room 2 days before casually walking by the pool.
At that time, the student called 911, and several officers responded.
You know the location?
The man was approached by the officers, but refused to give his name.
You got any ID? Good. What's your
Over there.
What's your
That's
name,
my
sir?
room.
Been out already?
So he was arrested in connection to the attacks and taken to Miami Police Headquarters for questioning. Under questioning, he denied any involvement in the attacks at the Banana Bungalow, but did give officers a name: Francisco Arce Montes.
He looked like a 50-year-old transient, not very well off, just kind of a loner traveling. seeing the world, he says. He also